Well, anyone, yeah. We haven't got a mic.
Well, I'd like to begin this evening's event and welcome you all here. Can you all hear me, both here and in Zoom land? We have far more people around the world zooming in at this moment. I don't know what time it is in their particular neck of the wood, but welcome to people from the wider blue planet, and welcome to you all here tonight. My name is Stephen Pickard. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. First of all, an apology from our colleague Bishop Philip Huggins, who's the Director of the Centre for Ecumenical Studies and the President of the National Council of Churches, and has worked with the Ambassador for the Environment, Jamie Isbister, for some time. Philip lives in Melbourne, and I probably don't need to say any more. I know they lifted the lockdown, but there's still many other hurdles to get over, and they were just a bridge too far. So Philip sends his apologies. We set this down for between 7 and 9:30 tonight, just to rest your weary souls. We probably won't take 2.5 hours. We'll probably go for about an hour and a half with a cup of tea and opportunity for conversations later on. So we're looking forward to that. Before I welcome our special guest tonight, it's so important, and you get a sense of it looking out over the grasslands here, that we are in fact on sacred ground and have been blessed to be here. And so we begin our session by acknowledging the first peoples of this country who have many, many thousands of years of friendship with this country that we are on as guests. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and those emerging leaders that are amongst us. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome back Mr. Jamie Isbister, Australia's Ambassador for the Environment. Welcome back, Jamie. You were here earlier on last year, probably about January 2020, if I remember. And at the time, we had a very enjoyable engagement in the large chapel of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. And at that time, you said you'd be only too willing to come back and update us on the latest news about what's happening. And we're very much aware that the Glasgow summit on Australia and the United Nations Climate Change Conference will take place in November this year, and will bring parties together to accelerate action towards the goals of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so, Jamie, you did agree to return with an update on how that's progressing. And in the meantime, of course, since last January, we've had a pandemic which has somehow amplified awareness of the risks facing us if we do not follow the science and we do not cooperate globally in this time of climate emergency. I make the point that for people of faith, the advocacy tasks are very clear. As the flyer indicated that you might have received, we are to encourage nations, including our Australia, to be transparently ambitious with nationally determined contributions. We are to encourage nations to be generous in terms of their financial, technical, and capacity building support of those nations who need this. And we are to encourage nations who are receiving support to be transparent about their circumstances. Well, Ambassador Jamie, we look forward to you updating us on these matters and others from your international work. And with your insights and conversation, we do very much look forward to an engagement with you in the course of the evening. So would you please welcome Mr. Jamie Isbister.
Thank you, Stephen. And while we sort of just set up the PowerPoint, hopefully which will work for those in the room and as well as those on the Zoom, I also want to just acknowledge the traditional landowners that we're on, the Ngunnawal people, the elders past and present, and acknowledging the the wisdom, knowledge and contribution that they've made to this land, but also the borderlands of Australia over tens of thousands of years. I think if anything, you know, one of the things about having a break or a holiday is actually reconnecting with the land, with the environment, and one appreciating the value of what we have and benefit from. And I think having come back recently from a couple of weeks of a camping trip, it puts you very much more front and centre in understanding and appreciating not just the importance of the land, but also I think how it contributes to us and its gift to us in terms of how we think about the whole range of challenging issues, with climate change being one of them. Steve, I just want to thank you and the Centre for hosting this discussion. I think I said last year when I took on, I'd only just taken this role on a couple of months before, that I saw one of my roles as the Ambassador for Environment and sort of our lead negotiator on international climate negotiations as a role to sort of be reaching out, not just internationally, to sort of engage with different countries, businesses and communities on the climate issue, but also engaging with Australians on the issue of climate, because I think we all know the climate issue has been a politically charged issue over many years. And I think one of the things I think I recall last year saying is that if we're going to collectively come together and find a way forward, we need to build more bridges, we need to build stronger understanding, and we need to try and find ways that we understand the fears, concerns and challenges that come with climate change, both the impacts of climate change, but also as we transition to a future of zero emissions, net zero, how we do that in a way that brings everyone along and respects the challenges that come with it. I also want to, I think I did see, I can't see now, that a big shout out to Bishop Huggins, to Philip. Philip, I think I can probably fairly say, has been the sort of the driver of some of this dialogue and engagement within the ecumenical movement of the churches more broadly. And I hope Philip doesn't mind me saying that I've met Philip a number of times over my career, but I met him at COP25 in Madrid, and he turned up in our delegation room. He'd sent me an email and he said he was keen to catch up, and I said I'd love to catch up and talk to him on things. And I remember he turned up and he was quite. It was a pretty hot environment for lots of reasons. And he came into the delegation room, and I remember his nose started bleeding, and he had quite a nosebleed, and we managed to find a first aid kit and sort of support him and stop the bleeding. But I say that because Philip was very generous actually in coming out and connecting with a lot of negotiators in a very human way. I'll be honest with you, it's not always easy. Negotiating on these issues has a lot of challenges, a lot of emotion, there's a lot of stress. And Philip was brought not just his own sort of personal touch to it, but also he brought a space that actually quite a few negotiators came together. Different interfaith negotiators came to just be able to be there, acknowledge the different sort of spiritual contributions and faith-based agencies. And to be honest, it was important as well in terms of actually finding a space that negotiators, when they're often sort of in rooms dealing with contested issues, they could just come and have that. And so I just want to acknowledge that and thank Philip for that. So look, I did promise to come back and give an update. I didn't quite expect it to be the update that we're on. Oh, you're right. When I came last time, I'm thinking it was maybe early February, but maybe it was January. But it was. I think we probably, some of us were trying to say coronavirus or trying to, what's that virus? And I think I had my last trip I did probably the week after I came here to Japan for a meeting called the Japan-Brazil Dialogue, which brings a number of key countries together as part of the road to COP26. And that was the last trip I'd done internationally, and things changed quite dramatically, as we all know. And it's had quite a big impact on the climate negotiations. Though we've tried to very much keep momentum on things, we haven't had any face-to-face meetings since then. For those on Zoom and for those who may be up at late nights, I've done many and continue to do many late night calls at the moment. And I think it's not ideal that it's brought us together in a different way. But I remember we were just coming out of the bushfires, the terrible impact that had on many communities, the environment. We talked on sort of where we're at with the climate negotiations and the year ahead. So some things have changed a lot, which I'll talk a little bit about. Some things have not changed much. I sort of think really, as I said earlier, what I'd like to do, and I'll move through the presentation reasonably quickly, is really just try and give you the best picture I can about what are the challenges we're currently facing, where are we at, what are some of the issues Australia and other countries are trying to resolve as we continue to build momentum into Glasgow. So hopefully those online can see what's on the screen. So look, first of all, Stephen started with the science, and I think, you know, the coronavirus has really highlighted that more than ever we need to, we need to acknowledge that understanding the science and what it's telling us is critical for us to deal with any issue, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's the climate change, and the science, the consensus is that human-produced emissions are responsible for warming. The IPCC forecasts warming of greater than 2 degrees by 2100. So that's what just on 80 years ago away. The IPCC, for those who are not so familiar, it's the Intergovernment Climate Change Committee that basically sort of is focused on bringing together scientists from across countries to regularly update and give policymakers an understanding of what it's telling us going forward. And it tells us we're going to have more frequent intense natural crises and disasters, more extreme temperatures, more rain and drought at different periods. We're going to have sea level rise and coastal inundation. We're going to have increasing challenges around what it means in the agriculture sector and the environmental costs with it. And so I think there's no debate and there's no uncertainty about how climate is changing and how it's impacting us. And as we know, we're already feeling it in Australia, and we're also, our region is feeling it as well. This just gives you a bit of a snapshot in terms of, you know, what the CSI report that came out at the end of last year, the Climate Report 2020. For those who are science-oriented and interested, it is worth having a look at that report. It's a report by our Premier Science Agency, and it says that the average temperature in Australia has increased by 1.44 degrees. This is increasing in extreme fire weather and the length of fire seasons, and sea levels are rising around Australia, and we've seen some of that through coastal inundations. And that report is something which is was considered as part of the Royal Commission in the bushfires, and it's also a report which obviously across government is being looked at in terms of how we both address how climate will impact on Australia and our own sort of response to climate change. I'll be honest, I stole this slide from Mark Howden. Some of you may have been at the presentation last week. ANU does an annual update on climate change. This is the only one I stole from him, but I will give him acknowledgement. But what it tells you is the global emissions over the last, well, since 1990 to now. And you can see that, it's been rising. You can see the drop-off, a small drop-off in about 2008, 2009. That was on the global financial crisis, and particularly the impact on a lot of countries in Eastern Europe and Russia. And then you can see quite a significant drop-off last year. That's basically as a result of COVID. So if there's anything positive from COVID, it has had a significant impact on emission reductions, and that's predominantly been a result of reductions in transport, flight, air traffic, people moving around, and the economy all broad. It's about 6.7% reduction, but obviously that's not a permanent drop. I mean, as economies return, that will rise again. Having said that, I think there's a number of things on the COVID front that has probably resulted in quite a lot of systemic changes that will keep emissions reducing. I think I can probably say that I'm certainly an advocate that in the international environment and climate negotiations, we need to be smarter about how we use technology to progress action. There will be the need for ongoing face-to-face engagement, but there's a lot of opportunities now and businesses to do things face-to-face. So just, countries are taking action. There's obviously a lot of concerns and rightfully about the gap between commitments and action. 37% of the global emissions come from China and the US, so obviously both those two are the key emitters. And then you can see the graph going down in terms of the different countries and their overall contributions. There's 190 countries that have Paris emission targets, including all the major economies. That's not actually completely accurate because the US actually is out of the Paris Agreement at the moment. They re-entered in 3 days. I spoke to my counterpart this morning and he told me he was freezing himself back into Paris. If you've seen the weather forecast at the moment in the US, they've got an unbelievable low, which is impacting on many people. But they're back in 3 days, so that will be true in 3 days' time again. Countries are making significant investments to transition to lower emissions, and I'll talk a bit more on that. And they will need to enhance actions over time to keep under 2 degrees. So the current commitments current governments have made is not going to be adequate to get us to under 2 degrees, which many people rightfully are concerned on. But what is important to realise with the Paris Agreement, and I think I probably said this last year, is it's the whole principle of Paris is it's a voluntary commitment mechanism rather than an enforced one, and it's a ratcheting mechanism. So every 5 years or earlier, every country is expected to ratchet up their ambition as they go forward. And people ask, well, what's going to make people do more than what they do? Well, what I can tell you is the Kyoto period, which I'll talk a bit about, only had about 30 to 40 countries involved with the 2 periods. It was much more of a top-down one. The Copenhagen summit back in 2009, they wanted to again mandate things, and countries just couldn't agree, and the negotiations fell apart. And what's been proven is if you can build peer pressure and accountability, that's what over time brings about the best results. Private sector's taking action. I mean, this has been, I'll be honest, you all have heard about the commitments different companies and that are making. There's very ambitious commitments that not just businesses are making now, but investor groups are making. And there's some examples in this. For example, just the Australian New Zealand Investor Group on climate change is over $2 trillion that they have a portfolio responsibility for, and they're focused on how that portfolio will invest in sustainable investments and emission and programs over time that will transition to net zero. And this is, I would say, in lots of my discussions with the private sector, this is something which has only got stronger during the COVID crisis. If you'd asked me in May or April, I probably would have said, yeah, I mean, with all the challenges to businesses and economies and that, the risk that climate change falls to the back of the bus as they try and deal with surviving. And if anything, it's actually had the opposite impact. I think businesses have seen that they're going to have to not only look at how the COVID crisis impacts on their bottom line, they use it as a hurdle to where before they might have been trying to look at how they graduated to different approaches, how they actually hurdle over some of that to investments that will accelerate efforts and make sure their businesses are going to be more resilient and dealing with the risks of climate going forward. So this is a milestone year. We've got the Paris Agreement actually comes into practice in 2020. So at the end of this, basically at the end of this year, it came into practice. So countries have made commitments in 2015. It actually sort of moves into implementation now this year. There's a number of countries, as you know, Japan, South Korea, China, US, others who have made additional commitments. We've got the Biden summit in just over 2 months, and the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement, as I mentioned, and negotiations are ramping up for the COP26, which will be held in Glasgow. It's also, I'll say, it's dominating almost every discussion I can now say I'm involved in. I don't always want to be, but in terms of the G7, the G20, APEC, the climate issue is something that's now coming right across Australia's engagement on different international issues. So it's a year of undoubtedly of action. So what does it mean for Australia? So this just gives you a quick sort of graph about our own emissions and projections. So you can sort of see, I know some of you probably can't read that, but the key thing on that is realising that our emissions have come down since 2005. It was about the year that we peaked. The main contributor to those reductions are actually the electricity sector. Our electricity sector is going through a very rapid transition. Because our electricity sector has traditionally been predominantly driven by fossil fuels, the reductions in that make a big difference to our overall emissions. I won't go through all the others. There's quite a lot there in terms of transport, stationary energy, agriculture, and there may be some questions that people want to sort of ask a bit more about that at the time. So here's a graph. So this is a graph in terms of Australia's emissions since 2005. Our peak was about 2007, as you can see, and then it's dropped since then. Our overall emissions have dropped from almost 17% from 2005. Our Paris commitment is to get to 26, 28%, so we're already almost 17% there. We've got another 10 years, obviously, to continue to accelerate those efforts. But it's not always well understood, and I know there'll be sort of views and debates, you know, what Australia's doing enough or not, etc. But it is important to be aware that Australia's commitments are emission reductions have come down 17% since 2005. New Zealand's has come about 1%, Norway's about 0%, and the OECD average is about 10%. Now, there's some reasons for that. Part of it is because some of those other countries have already got their electricity sector down to almost zero renewables, and so they're now working on the hard-to-abate sectors, which is the industry, stationary heating, and whatever else. But to be on the other side of it, it's also to acknowledge that Australia's history is we are a relatively flat country. We don't have nuclear, and our grids haven't been connected. So the simple reality is that the efforts that we've got to make to get our electricity sector down to net zero is not without significant challenges. So Australia's changing energy mix. As I mentioned, the national energy market, which is basically most of Southeast Australia, it doesn't include Western Australia. The market has gone through a dramatic transition over the last 10 years. 12 coal-fired power stations have phased out in the last 10 years. And if you're interested in what the projections on this going forward are, you can look at the Australian Energy Market Authority to see their projections about when future coal and gas generation will finish. Over the last 5 months, from September 2020 to January 2021, 30% of Australia's electricity and then was from renewables. So that's over the whole period, the whole month. And you've got to remember that a lot of the growth has been in wind and solar, which obviously predominantly occurs during the day, not all. Wind obviously does also occur in other periods. And the moves have gone so fast on this, as you're hearing, is genuinely the balance at the moment is to try and make sure you can get stability in the grid, which is if you're going to get those renewables coming in and those new renewable energy zones in, whether it's in the Hunter or Wagga or Forbes or South Australia, wherever it might be, you also need to be ensuring that you can bring that in and firm it up with what people used to call baseload power, which is basically generating electricity in the evening and the morning. And recently, having gone to solar battery in my own household and being able to monitor that, you do realise just how critical that sort of 7 o'clock to 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning is, and then that sort of sundown from 5 till 9, and that window is really where we've got to be developing the models around battery storage, pumped hydro, and others that can provide us the firming on that. So Australia's emissions targets, I mentioned, again, I apologise, some of this is a bit hard to see, but Australia is obviously the green one. It's 26-28%. Japan's is I think it's 24%. New Zealand's 30%. Canada's 30%, and the EU is about 50, though. A number of these will be updating. My expectation they'll be updating their national internal contributions before the COP. And you can see on the right-hand side, that's actually percentage reductions in emissions. So one height is overall emissions, what we've got to bring it down to, and you can see the other one is on the right-hand side is important because that's about the growth, that reflects population growth and growth in economies. And so Australia's actually got a harder lift over that period under current NDCs. I acknowledge things may change than China, New Zealand, Canada, Japan. And that basically reflects Australia's stronger economic growth over recent years and our population growth over other countries. Since I met, people have probably heard about the technology roadmap. It sounds like, you know, I'll be honest, when I first heard it, it was like, technology roadmap, what does that mean? I'll try and break it down, but I'll be honest with you, there's two important things that I would say. At a macro level, the government's made commitments on. One of them is following the bushfires, the acknowledgement that the climate's impacting us, we need to change, we need to adapt, and the recommendations that have come out of the Royal Commission about what's got to be done around a new authority to drive recovery, resilience going forward. And the second one is the launch technology roadmap, which is basically saying we need to get to net zero and we need the technologies that are going to do that. I won't go through all these figures. I'll focus on this. There's 140 technologies in that. A lot of them are graded in the technology roadmap as which ones are going to be more influential than others. But I'll focus on the top 5. These are the 5 the government has put money into and will, over time, potentially increase their efforts. Clean hydrogen under $2 a kilogram. This is important because if you get hydrogen at $2 a kilogram, it just commercially replaces basically petrol, gas, diesel as a source of fuel. Hydrogen is critical in potentially getting us to produce green steel, so we can replace metallurgical coal and we can create steel from zero emissions. Currently, manufacturing steel generates about 8% of global emissions. It's not insignificant. Transport, the talk of hydrogen being a fuel for trains, trucks and planes. It also being a key source of fuel for cement production, industrial production, which is hard to replace on other forms. Energy storage basically battery, pumped hydro, getting it under $100 per megawatt hour. If you do that, and this area is moving fast, you know, it just immediately replaces a lot of the traditional base loads of coal, gas-fired power stations, because the cost of being able to use the sun and the wind to then drive battery, which then close those windows I talked about in the morning and evening. So that's a key technology. The third one's CO2 compression for transport and storage, carbon capture and storage. I'll give you the term on. It's under $20 per tonne. Now, this is something, as you know, that's been debated. There's a lot of views about the pros and cons of carbon capture. I won't go through all these out, but what I will tell you is it's almost universally accepted. Well, it is from the IPCC that you will need some form of carbon capture and storage if you're going to get cement and industrial productions to net zero as soon as possible. There's often been the debate in the past was about how it could be used to allow ongoing sort of generation of coal or gas and whatever else. And there'll continue to be debates on this, but the key part of this around the IPCC's view on this is if you're going to accelerate the hard abate sectors, you will need this at least as a for a period of time. The fourth one is green steel and aluminium. It's basically producing steel under $900 a tonne and getting green aluminium under $2,700. I think you all know, to turn bauxite into aluminium, you need a hell of a lot of electrons. It is very, very power hungry. You need to be able to get the generation that's going to drive that going forward. And so how do we get the costs and how do we find the investments that are going to do that? And this is critical for our own domestic production, but more importantly, as we continue to be an exporter of iron ore, of pig iron, of manufactured aluminium and steel, this not only is critical to getting global emissions to net zero, but it's also critical in terms of, honestly, the job opportunity for Australia going forward. And the fifth one is soil carbon measurement under $3 per hectare. And I've already got a question on this, I think from John, which I'll come to later. But this is basically important because we increasingly realise the value of our soils and our marine coastlines on sequestering carbon. And if you're going to be able to understand how you're going to utilise our environmental assets as a key part of climate solution, you've got to understand what they can actually store. So what you want to do is you need to be able to measure it. And if you can get it at $3 per hectare, it's going to drive a whole sort of market where nature-based solutions, land care and environment becomes commercially an attractive option for companies and others who want to buy offsets. I know I'm getting a bit technical on that. I can talk a bit more on that if people are interested. So the key thing on this is these technologies is it's not about just Australia getting net zero. That's important, but it's also, and I think I said this last time in the last set. If I speak to my Singaporean counterpart, my Japanese colleague, South Korean, they've got 2050 net zero targets. The only way they get there is importing clean energy from Australia and green products from Australia. And so that transition that is going to have to happen is not only critical for us domestically, but how we are also then a driver of that going forward. Singapore just simply cannot produce the amount of renewable energy they need when their own energy needs are going north at a rapid pace with cloud software and a whole range of other elements. I don't know, well, last time, I don't think I've actually got the slides here. No, I haven't. Let me quickly check. No, I haven't. So what I'll quickly display here is two projects it's worth having a look at, right? One's called Sun Table. It's up in Tennant Creek. It's about 700 kilometres south of Darwin. It's going to produce about 10 gigawatts of electricity by 2026, 27. It's going to, Twiggy Forest and White Cannon Brooks are investors amongst a number of others. It's going to be basically a massive solar wind, predominantly solar, some wind farm that will provide a high voltage cable to Darwin. It will basically provide renewable energy to all of Darwin. It'll then increase the voltage to tens of thousands of voltage. It'll put it down in a high voltage DC cable, send it under Indonesia to Singapore and provide 20% of Singapore's power. And so that's just one example of a project that's up and running and in the next 5 years. One that's 3 times the size of that, the Asia Renewables Hub. Have a look at that in the Pilbara. It's going to generate 24 gigawatts of power. It's going to be a massive solar and wind farm, and it's going to basically produce green ammonia and green hydrogen, which will then be sold to most likely Korea and Japan, potentially other markets as well, to assist them partly for Japan, which is very dependent on coal-fired power stations. They can burn green ammonia in there as part of it and reduce the emissions as they move to other net zero options. But green ammonia and hydrogen is also critical for transport, as I mentioned. So what, yeah, just mentioning, so looking to develop a major hydrogen fuels hub, so the government's committed to a hydrogen hub that will allow that development of that export industry. Australia is exporting currently 54% of all lithium. So when you talk about lithium batteries, critical minerals, the majority of it at the moment comes from Australia. Bolivia actually holds more, but currently hasn't got the market to provide. So there's a critical supply chain there for us. How do we ensure that that continues and we can that can be accelerated for Thailand, Korea, Japan, who are then manufacturing them into batteries. And as I mentioned, the opportunities for direct export of renewable energy. So how are we working with others? Okay, I'm now just going to move a little bit on beyond the sort of emission reductions. How is Australia supporting other countries? So part of it is under the Paris Agreement, there was a commitment of $100 billion being provided as climate financing every year from this year. So that commitment's not been made. The latest projections had us on about $80 billion. This is in the international community. That's money that's not just money from public sector, but where public sector's leveraging funding from the private sector. So particularly for renewables projects, mitigation is about anything that reduces emissions, and adaptation, which is about how countries can respond and deal with the impacts of climate change. Australia committed $1 billion back in Paris in 2015, and we've met that target. It's finished last year. We got to 1.4 billion. I'll give a couple of examples on that later. The Prime Minister announced at the end of last year a new commitment for $1.5 billion, so a 50% increase on climate financing, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more on that. But a few examples. So one, the Tina River Hydro project in Solomons. Currently, Solomons, about 97% of its electricity comes from diesel generators. People been to Solomons, it's noisy, it's expensive. When in my former job, when I was a humanitarian coordinator, I was involved with trying to deal with the impact of a large oil ship that had hit a coral reefs and was bleeding diesel out about 3 years ago across the Solomons. It had a devastating impact on the environment. So this project will basically move Solomons off diesel, certainly all of Honiara, onto renewable energy going forward. So it drives down both the costs, so electricity will be cheaper, but it's also the renewables. Another one, I might have mentioned this last time, but Savannah fire management, this initially got quite a lot of coverage actually, if you're calling the bushfires, and need to look at Indigenous fire management practices. This is actually something through the development program that we've been doing for almost 10 years. When I was in Africa, we took this project up when there was terrible bushfires in Botswana and looked at Australian Indigenous organisations coming and looking at how to do coal burns and looking at the... Now, the key thing on this is if you can look at how you manage savanna environments through more effective environmental and fire management, you reduce the large wildfires that generate much more emissions, but also have a much more devastating impact on soils and the environment going forward. Another Markham Valley project. This is a large solar farm in the Pacific, in PNG, where it is about to get up and running. Okay, I'll turn to the international negotiations, COP26. So I think I'm aware that a lot of people sort of think, these COPs, these climate summits, people get together, they talk about things, really, and then it's sort of like the news clip is either it was a successful or it was a failure. That was basically, I think, more often than not what people hear, right? So I'll try and, in a very simple way, just unwrap it a little bit and give you a bit more of an idea of what at least are we heading to going into the next year. So just quickly, the history of it. The International Climate Agreements, the first establishment of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was in 1992. Rio, it was agreed that we needed a framework to guide international efforts on climate change. Following that, there was the Kyoto Protocol, meetings held in Kyoto in Japan. The protocol basically was looking at how developed countries took responsibility for reducing emissions, acknowledging the impact it was having on our environment. 40 developed countries pledged to reduce emissions. Australia was one of them. And that Kyoto Protocol, so that was 40 developed countries. It wasn't all countries. Other countries could make voluntary commitments. Some did, some didn't. But it created quite a tense issue. As the climate issue evolved, there was this view, well, why, if we're thinking of a global issue, do we not have all countries trying to be part of this solution? which led to the Copenhagen summit in 2009. And I think some of you may remember that the headlines on that was a failure. And there was a lot of reporting that came out of that. The Cancun Agreement was the one following that. So that was an agreement to say, okay, we need to get up off the floor. We need to find some way forward on this. And it was held in Mexico, and it brought 100 countries made voluntary commitments to reduce emissions. And that's where the $100 billion pledge came. So it was initially outlined at Copenhagen, but countries then committed to it. And then there was a whole lot of ongoing debates to say, how do we get a new agreement that can bring everyone together, that can try and manage it? And that was the Paris Agreement 2015. And that basically includes all countries, at least 190 countries. There's a few that aren't in it or haven't pledged, but very few. And it's basically a voluntary mechanism that every 5 years countries are required to ratchet up their ambition in how they're reducing emissions, how they're adapting, and how they're contributing or providing finance to others. So yeah, the Paris Agreement goals: reduce emissions to keep warming below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to get to as close to 1.5. Adaptation, but where countries are looking at how they're going to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the third one's basically financing. How do we get the level of finance that's going to be needed to get to net zero as soon as possible, to transition all of our economies, energy systems, transport systems to that, and how are we going to provide financing to countries who are already being heavily impacted by climate change through a whole range of different adaptation aspects. It could be support for agriculture, it could be around science forecasting, it could be around seawalls, etc. So I think I've touched on this about 5 years, the ratcheting mechanism, but a lot of other countries are also within those 5 years already increasing their commitments. So in 2021, countries are putting forward updated further commitments. So 73 have lodged updated or new NDCs, nationally determined contributions. That's basically your emissions target. 42 have submitted a long-term strategy. A long-term strategy is basically saying, how is the country going to get to net zero? Many people, obviously, there's a lot of debate around the whole question about Australia's position and whether we'll get to net, we make net zero. The Prime Minister made comments recently about getting net zero as soon as possible and preferably by 2050. But the government has committed to getting its long-term strategy out before COP26. That's this year. And that long-term strategy, I will flag with you, is very important. It genuinely is going to have with it a very clear outline of what the government is going to be doing in a whole range of different sectors to get to net zero. Whether that has a target on or not is obviously a political decision that will be made by cabinet. But it'll take that tech roadmap and then take it to the next level of what that means in terms of additional funding and additional measures that are need to be taken. 133 have indicated a commitment to net zero. So not all of them are 2050. As you know, China's committed to 2060. Others have got slightly different target dates. And countries are also putting forward new climate financing and adaptation commitments. As I mentioned, Australia put those forward at the end of last year. Climate summit negotiations. So what are the outstanding issues? Now, these, for those who've got a good memory, might remember this from last time. I'll simplify 3 things. Now, I'm simplifying, okay? There's a lot more, but the 3 big things. Article 6, what the hell's that? International carbon markets. That's basically establishing rules for how person X, I'll put it in a very simple case, it could be my neighbour needs more power at 7 o'clock because they're going to turn their oven on. I've got surplus power at the same time. I'm going to sell them my electrons, they buy them. That's a market between 2 houses. Basically, the international carbon markets is trading between countries, allowing businesses to purchase off other environments. And so you need rules that are going to give confidence that you're going to deliver that. But it's not just like, if I'm going to get your $5, that's actually, when I'm going to go and use it, it's actually a real $5. It's actually resulted in emission reductions. And that's easier said than done. There's quite a lot of complications about getting those rules in place. And Australia is committed to getting strong, rigorous rules. We don't currently use international carbon markets. Some companies buy credits voluntarily, but if you're going to get to net zero, we will need international carbon markets to get The second issue is transparency rules. So this is about, it's fine to set targets, but if you haven't got clear outlines to what you're reporting on, you know, the level of reporting and the confidence on that, well, you know, what's the point of the target? So we need more progress to ensure that the commitments countries are making, that they're actually going to translate to clear confidence in the reporting information of what emissions have come from your electricity sector or your energy sector. You can criticise Australia for a range of things in terms of, you know, the questions on ambition targets and whatever else. Australia is seen as a world leader on our reporting our inventories, on being able to report on what we're emitting from and what level. And the third one is around global finance. That's about the amount of money that I mentioned. And the big issue on this is countries feeling that even if we get to the 100 billion, most of that is going into mitigation. So when I mitigation, that's projects like solar farms, hydro, so where it's easy to get the private sector in on that. The private sector can make money out of that. They can invest in projects. What it's very hard to get money from is adaptation. So that's basically, you know, Stephen's sort of holiday house, you know, it's starting to get inundated by sea level rises and that. We're going to have to move Stephen back back half an acre, and we're going to have to, you know, raise the seawalls. It's expensive. Doesn't have a lot of commercial benefits from it. The bank's not exactly sort of saying so. So that's where the heavy lifting funding comes from, and a lot of countries feel there's not enough money on that, and it's only getting worse. That is going to be one of the big issues that we're going to be dealing with. And for Pacific Island countries, it's understandably a very big concern. I won't bore you with periodic reviews, loss and damage, capacity building, unless you want me to come back on it. So beyond the negotiations, this is the bit that I'm excited about and growing, because in the past it used to be a bunch of people like me going into dark rooms and talking about things with acronyms or whatever else that made a little sense, and you come out and did we actually move anything. What's now being built around these climate summits once a year is campaigns. So these are the campaigns that we want to be bringing governments, private sector, civil society, and etc. in to deliver the action we need. And there's 5 at the moment. One on adaptation resilience, that's what I talked about. How countries committing to new approaches on this. Energy, how are we sharing experiences, knowledge, how are we incentivising that acceleration in energy. Transport, how are we getting transport to net zero. Nature-based solutions, how we better understand the environment we've got, the asset it can provide for climate action longer term. And finance, this is bigger than just the money to developing countries. This is about leveraging all that super funds, all that investor stuff in a direction that's going to get to net zero. And Mark Carney, the former head of the Canadian Central Bank and the UK Central Bank, is now the champion of this financing stream. There's champions under each of these, but at the moment are driving efforts. And so there's a lot of the COP. This is what I'd call the sort of, I made the mistake the other day of saying it's like the Earth and then the planets going around it, and then realising actually, you know, these things that Galileo has moved on. Is the sun is the COP negotiations. That's where the heat and the, but then you've got all the planets that are going around, which are basically these campaigns. This is the solar system that's going to drive the sort of action. So the negotiations is, you know, governments dealing with, you know, the political aspects, the ambition, the sort of life. But then these campaigns is how people become part of it. And this is a bit that we're keen to try and get more focus on. This is where I think you can all look at ways you can be engaged on. And you can get more information on the COP26 website, and each of them, there's quite a lot of detail on these campaigns. One of them I want to touch on is nature-based solutions. And this is going to start coming to one of the questions I know somebody wants to ask me, is there's a lot of views about sort of, you know, well, we're doomed, you know, like science tells us we're doomed, you know, the transition to net zero, seriously, you know, the targets aren't meeting us, and whatever. Yes, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned. It is a very challenging environment we face. The international community is genuinely moving, and there is real progress. But one of the things I also want to emphasise is the realisation about how critical, one might say very ironic, our environment is to net zero and the climate solutions. Of all the emissions that go up every year, 25% of it is sequestered in by
by land, 25% by oceans, and 50% adds to the atmosphere. So if you look at that, you realise how important our oceans and how important the land out there is to sequestering carbon, taking carbon in and putting it into our soils. And increasingly what we're realising is that that is an investment that is not only critical to protect our environment and our biodiversity, but it's a key solution to getting us to net zero, to reducing it. So as much as you might put a solar farm up, actually better managing that 1,000 hectares of land can also bring about the same mitigation efforts. One of them sequestering it in, but if we don't look after our land and we don't look after our oceans, then their ability to sequester carbon reduces and it becomes a bigger problem. So the positive thing on this is you've got these things coming together, realising that the issue no longer is we should look after the environment because we're stewards of it, and we need to look after the environment because it's important to our sort of livelihood and whatever else, but it's also realising that we need to look after the environment, our oceans, because it's as critical to getting us to net zero and reducing emissions as it is transitioning our electricity sector net zero and not. And that's why that soil carbon $3 is important, because if you can better measure it, it's good. Now, I've got a question I know coming on land, but what I will say is blue carbon, which is basically marine coastline, so that's sea grasses, mangroves. Every time you walk past a mangrove area, you should bless it. You know, it basically sequesters about 5 times more carbon than any land environment will. So they're critical because they're not only critical for biodiversity, they protect your fish, that whole, but they sequester 5 times the amount of carbon than any other sort of environment, and they also obviously provide a level of adaptation and resilience. And this is why in the Pacific, it's one of the areas that we really want to try and look at how we can support it, because if you've got seagrasses and mangroves that are in healthy states, they can reduce the impact of tidal surges that are going to come, already coming from the impacts of climate change. So that overlap is an area where there's a lot of discussion happening at the moment. And so when you're hearing a bit of the debate, and I'll be careful about not getting political on this, about the debate, you know, the National Farmers Federation talks about 2050 net zero, and they talk about not wanting to carve agriculture out. What they're basically saying is that we acknowledge agriculture as part of the solution to getting to net zero, and we want to look at how we can be incentivised to better look at manage the land, and through that being part of the solution going forward. But that's obviously an international issue as well. So looking ahead, look, I've touched on some of these things, so with time I won't go through them. But what I will say is, and I'm sure there'll be people who want to ask me questions about certain things, and some of them I may or may not be able to answer. But what I will say is, you've got to remember, climate change is a transformational issue globally. It's impacting on individuals, businesses, communities now in a whole load of different ways. When you live in democratic countries, you need to be able to ensure that as we manage that transition, it's done in a way that people feel that they can be part of the solution, and they're going to be able to manage the opportunities and the downsides that come with it. And that's a really important thing to remember, because the challenges we face in Australia are almost exactly the same challenges I face in the negotiating rooms every day with countries. And that part of that is acknowledging, like, and this is where I think, you know, not to get, but in terms of a faith perspective or from a spiritual perspective, is that if we're going to get to where we need to better understand each other. We need to have a better communication and empathy. And for too long, the climate issue has been a binary issue. And from whatever side one's on, it's been one where it's been at times throwing rocks one way or the other. And that critical thing about building that trust and the bridges, you'll still have debates like you do on anything, is going to be critical to our future going forward. So just finishing on that in terms of role of churches and communities. These are a couple of very practical things, but I've made my point before about what I think churches who represent rural, urban communities, represent the full diversity of Australia, why they can also be that bridge. But, you know, there's a lot of practical things you can do about sort of more energy efficient appliances, insulations, the solar PV, hybrids, electric vehicles, obviously lifestyle changes, voluntary carbon assets. You can actually make your church. There's a program called Climate Active. I encourage you to have a look at it. It's an Australian initiative. It's basically where you can purchase offsets and make your business or your church or your home net zero. And you can do it through a range of very practical suggestions I give you, but also you can buy voluntary carbon offsets, which contributes at times to those projects I mentioned on nature-based solutions and others in our region. So look, I'll stop there. Hopefully that, I know there's a lot in that, and it's sort of swept across not just the negotiations or whatever else, but it's also covered quite a lot of other issues around sort of Australia's current dynamics and international issues. So I'll stop there. While you're rounding up some questions, I have got a question here already. Thank you. It's John, isn't it? John. Do you want to read your question, or you can read it? Fantastic. It might be, yeah.
Okay. So, according to the Menzies Research Centre, the carbon in Australia's topsoils is equivalent to about 200 years of our national carbon emissions. Therefore, a small percentage addition to the carbon in our soil can substantially reduce our net carbon emissions. What are the barriers in the Paris Agreement with regard to soil carbon playing a greater role in climate change abatements, and what are the cost barriers?
Yeah. John, a good question. As I won't repeat what I said in terms of just the value that soil has and the value that land and oceans have in sequestering carbon. And the point that John's getting is right. The evidence basically says that the ability for our soils to be able to sequester carbon when they're managed and treated well is very substantial. There's lots of reasons why you're not going to be able to get anywhere near that level, but as you said, if you take a small percentage of it, it makes a real difference. The barriers of it are two things. One, we haven't got international rules established yet that allows that trade. Now, because if you're going to sort of if you ask farmers, they'll say, well, we're willing to do it, but we're already facing droughts, we're already facing high mortgages, we're already struggling on it, and we're required to manage that land or not deforest it and put more livestock on it. We need some level of incentives to sort of be able to look after that, which means keeping pests out, looking at what the right sort of plants and maybe things they're going to plant. They're going to hold that topsoil down, and then are going to be able to act as sinks over the longer term. So we need markets established that can provide that rigour. And then I would basically say once you've got that in place, the second one is then being able to measure it. So because the risk, the challenge sometimes is you can put a solar farm up, and right now I can tell you how many offsets that is. Right, it generates this amount, sell the offsets, done. It's quite an easy commercial thing. Land, soils and oceans is harder. How can you know how much that hectare is going to be able to sequester carbon over and against, potentially a rainforest or somewhere in the hinterland of Brisbane? And that's why that technology target of measuring under $3 a hectare, if you can do that, then through geospatial and other mapping, you've got the evidence and science to say, if a farmer or a community manages that land, it'll offset this amount over these next 10 years. You can sell that offset and through established rules. Yeah, so that's probably, hopefully, helps answer the question.
We'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, good.
And then we'll pick up some questions on the chat.
On the chat, yeah, fine.
Well, thanks very much, Jamie. I think it shows that Australia's really doing some good work, and I think especially the technology roadmap and the soil carbon work really shows it. What I'd like to do is take us back to the bigger perspective of the risks of climate change. And just chatting with some friends, we were talking about what's the radiative forcing, that is the speed at which we're heating the planet. We know that we've got over the last million years, CO2 was below 280 parts per million. Now, if you add in all of the methane and albedo and other things, we're up above 500 parts per million now. So about 420 of CO2 and another 100 or so of all of these other greenhouse gases. So really, to
think about getting the CO2 equivalent level back down to the Holocene norm if we're not going to have all of our coasts flooded a lot more than we're worried about. If we're not going to have the Arctic melt, all of these tipping points that have been so much identified. And so the problem that I have with a lot of the IPCC discussion that you've been describing is that net zero emissions is set as the goal. Now, if the world happens to reach net zero emissions by 2050, then we've still got 500 parts per million of CO2 equivalent in the air, double what the sea level required. And so the question is, where is negative emission technology in the IPCC debate? Where is the thinking about also brightening of the planet through solar radiation management, etc.? These things are on the margin, unfortunately, and I really believe that they should be central to the international climate debates.
Yeah. He's happy to take that. Do you want me to take one or two more, and then I can respond to a few questions at once? Yeah.
You showed a graph from Mark Harden lecture recently, and I was there also, but he actually said, on, net zero is not the main game, it's the budget. And we have 9.3 years, he said, left in the budget for 1.5 degrees, only 27 for 2 degrees. I'm interested in your representing Australia in all of these types of things. To what extent do you reflect back to the government and get them to focus on the main game? Because they're not, they only focus on this, whether we're going to get something.
Yep, fine. One more, yeah.
Thanks, Jamie. It was great to hear the land and traditionally Indigenous people know a lot about it. What explicitly is going on with engagement with traditional owners to, first of all, honour the, who and the connection with the land that these people are, our people are, but also to bring forward the knowledge, because there may be ways that we can help to conceive things we call carbon. Indigenous knowledge can be taken and naming those, to do that question.
Yeah, good. No, thanks. Look, all good questions, all challenging in their own ways, and to be honest, there's no simple answers with them, and there's a little bit of overlap between the first two, but let me try and sort of answer. The first one, look, it is true. The issue is not simply getting to net zero, right? But you've got to, if you're going to get to where we need to, you're going to need to have those different sort of, measures, build confidence of how we're going to get there. And the view is that getting the 2050 net zero is going to be critical to us preventing the tipping points on a whole range of aspects of it. But it's not as if you're going to hit 2050 net zero and you just plateau out. The focus undoubtedly is going to be, and there's already countries that are talking about the issue about one, getting there before 2050, but also looking at once you have plateaued and you've transitioned a lot of those sectors that are emitting so much carbon dioxide, the ability for both natural and potentially other technologies that may evolve, as you touched on, Robert, that can then take it to negative zero, will undoubtedly play into it and surface. I'd be cautious about, there's a lot of, the IPCC doesn't ignore negative zero technologies, they do talk on them. There's cautions about the risks with them. There's a lot of balloon ideas out there about how you can very quickly get reduce temperatures and that. But we've also had quick fixes to pest problems in Australia, and we've resulted in rabbit plagues and whatever else. So the point being that ensuring when you're playing with those environments, we need to ensure that the technologies that we put in place are ones which, based on science, are going to deliver, one, the outcomes needed, but also is not going to have a whole range of flow-on perverse impact effects. But I think your point,
generally is right. It's not, and it links into the budget question. It's not about simply saying, get to 2050 net zero, we're done. It's going to be an ongoing sort of challenge for us to look at how we're managing the impacts and the solutions we're going to need. But you've got to remember, it's only 5 years that we moved from language that said, nobody basically committed 2050 net zero 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the language was that we would get to net zero by the second half of this century. And within 5 years, you're now at a point where I think, as I said, 133 countries have indicated their intention to get to 2050. And so that's the point about the Paris thing, that as the IPCC reports come out, how it ratchets and builds our ambition out. And to your point, yeah, Mark's point, and I would agree with it, is that it's not just about 2050 net zero, it's about when it's done. And the view is that if you don't close the budget earlier, the costs increase later. And I think that is a clear challenge, and I think that's what is leading to acceleration of efforts by countries, both on targets but also on actions. And this isn't an argument against that over time countries, including Australia, increasing our targets as Paris requires, but it is also the aspect that if we're going to get to net zero, we're going to have to drive new practices of farming and on our oceans, and we're going to have to drive new technologies that are going to accelerate that effort as soon as possible. And that issue about how that's done faster is going to be a real live debate now. Your question, well, my role in government, what do you advise government? Look, as I said, in a democratic environment, politicians get elected, they make decisions. The role of public service is to provide them the very, very best clear advice we can based on science. We've got the CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, a range of other departments that are regularly putting up their views, perspectives and issues on these aspects of it. And my role particularly is being able to give the government the clearest advice about where other countries are at, what the pressures, what the realities and what the gaps are at times between what internationally has been committed to and what isn't. But once governments make decisions, it's the role of public servants to then be able to deliver and best advance those commitments going forward. But I think you can read the papers and see the level of views and perspectives feeding into the whole issue at the moment, and what that means in terms of the growing focus internationally and domestically on the challenge of climate. The third one, I think it's good. It's a really interesting thing about the voice of Indigenous people, as we all know, for too long has been ignored or hasn't been included in a whole range of issues about our environment, our land, and on climate. One of the things that came out of the COP in Madrid the COP in Madrid, which Australia was an activist on, was the establishment of an Indigenous Peoples Platform, which is basically giving a platform into those campaigns where Indigenous people will have a voice to not only put forward what they believe are the challenges and the concerns and the views they have on climate and how to manage, but also the solutions and the approaches and their experience to be able to look at what that means in terms of actions countries take. And there's a very strong stream. The Canadians are very strong. A lot of Indigenous groups in Canada, in Latin America, in the Pacific, and I'm genuinely keen to look at how we can strengthen Indigenous participation in our delegation and at the COP to be looking at sharing Indigenous experience on, as I said, on land management, fire management, nature-based solutions, marine coastlines, because it's genuinely, I think, been an area that we just haven't listened to and looked at how we reflect that in the discussion. The other part of it is looking at how we actually bring Indigenous voices into negotiations. The other thing I've learned is how different cultural approaches to resolving conflict can be a real asset when you're dealing with really difficult issues. And sometimes the sort of traditional sort of Western European approach and structures is not always the best mechanism to get some of the solutions we need. So but we're also really interested in looking at how we bring that experience of conflict management and negotiation into those perspectives.
Jamie, if I could read out a couple
Yeah,
of the
go for it.
questions that are coming through from around the world. If I can read it. The question is, I have a question, the person says, about how you look at the Warsaw mechanism, loss and damage. Do you think that we will have this kind of mechanism to help those who are most impacted by climate-related disasters and with low or no capacity to cope with the damages? This also includes the huge question about forced migration due to climate-induced disasters. And the person says, and for transparency, I work for World Council of Churches on climate justice and work very closely with Bishop Philip Huggins.
Good, okay. Well, do you want me to take another?
Why not? Oh, do you want me to read a few?
Maybe read
I'll
one or
read a
two
few.
more and then I can...
He said it's great. It needs to be spread far and wide what we're talking about. But I don't know if it works this way out. Here. The other way. The IPCC, Jamie, regards population growth, along with economic growth, as a driver of climate change. When will stabilisation of population be seen as a significant mitigation measure? Very interesting question. And Australia has a harder lift because of population growth. It's one of the great downsides of population growth, inability to reach reduction emission targets.
Okay, do you want me to...
I think that'll go.
Okay, fine. So yeah, we've got a few experts on the line, so always a risk of that. The Warsaw mechanism of loss and damage, I'll try and just break it down for you. Basically, it's saying that climate change has been the result of emissions that have incurred over many decades, one could argue centuries, and that has already resulted in damage being done to vulnerable countries and vulnerable communities. And so how is that acknowledged through the Paris Agreement, and then compensation, one might argue, is then paid. That's sort of what the focus is. It's one of the hot issues because the question comes then around how do you determine what the loss is, how much of it's come from climate change, and who then really takes responsibility for it. And developed countries would argue that it's an acknowledgement of the impact climate change is having, and that's why we need the $100 billion goal, and the stepping up of climate financing is critical to ensure that we're mitigating those aspects and that. But again, the view of a lot of countries would be, yeah, well, that's looking at things going forward. We're still not dealing with the impacts backwards and how that's. And so the Warsaw mechanism is trying to look at a way of bringing the parties together to try and agree a way forward on that and negotiate how you deal, one, acknowledge that, but then in acknowledging that, what the sort of solutions and options are. It's a challenging one. It was discussed at Madrid and it's due to come back up at COP26, and it sounds like the person at World Council of Churches is going to be ensuring the views and perspectives of the churches globally are going to contribute to that, and my view on that is that's critical. It's critical to have the perspectives of civil society and a whole range of parties if we're going to be able to understand the issue and the solutions on it. Yeah, easy, aren't they? Population growth, economic growth, the impacts of that. Look, you can answer this lots of ways. I'm going to cut myself free on this one. What I'm going to say is, yes, population growth is, by the nature of it, results in greater emissions. Having said that, if you can find ways that we transition to a zero emissions future, then it's not so much about, I'm not understating the footprint people have, but that footprint gets a lot less, and in some instances gets them at zero. And so I think we need to be careful that we're not overly sort of pointed the figure on sort of saying people are the problem and population growth itself is the problem. Having said that, I acknowledge the constraints and the impact population growth has on many countries and on many things. I'll finish on saying the biggest thing you can do about population growth is sexual reproductive health and education. And I'll stop on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, and education of women. Yeah.
Jamie, it's about 8:20. We're going to have a cup of tea and cup of coffee that we can enjoy having some further conversations with you for those that would like to stay. And so I know there's much more that could be said, many more questions that are sitting there amongst us. But I'm going to stop this part of the proceedings now. And I want to say thank you so much. It strikes me that it's very easy to become frustrated or very angry about this topic. And you can see that in the public space. So I want to thank you for locating this conversation in the context of learning to build trust again. And it's the only way forward. And I think the churches and other religious traditions and people of goodwill who have that real sense of the importance of trust have a real part to play in this big kind of wicked problem, so to speak. And so thank you tonight for sort of exemplifying that in the way you've gone about speaking to us. This issue of building trust is so fundamental. We're very glad that you are the Australia's ambassador for the environment. And if there are ways in which we can help that work, and you've indicated a few of them tonight, but we also want to let you know that we really want to support you and the task that you have, because it's a daunting job, and it's a lose-lose sometimes. As the hand in the sandwich, so to speak, between government that you're reporting to and public services serving government, and seeing things happen which you're not happy with, but yet negotiating and compromising and helping to build those networks of friendship and trust, which you're quite marvellous at doing. So thank you so much for spending your evening tonight and coming to speak with us. And thank you people on Zoom for enduring a few things. I think during the Zoom, some of the slides were frozen, but you could still hear Jamie, and so I know that you would have really benefited from that greatly. So thank you again, and would you please thank Jamie. There is an opportunity for tea and coffee and a chat, and don't run away too quickly, Jamie, although I know you're going to. So thank you again for coming, and please enjoy the next 15, 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, it was terrific. Thank you so much. Oh, really great.
Always hard to know. Not pitching in.
No.
Yeah.